Do you enjoy chilling stories, mysterious legends, and tales that make you think twice before turning off the lights? Then you're in the right place. On this channel, every video is a journey into the unknown, bringing you spooky tales, curiosities, and mysteries you won't find just anywhere. So hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who also loves a good dark story. That way you'll help our community grow and make sure you don't miss the next tale.
12 Tales from the Backwoods, stories only country folk will understand. When the sun sets over the farmlands and darkness creeps across the dirt roads, it's time to light the bonfire, pull up an old wooden chair, and listen to the tales that country folks tell. Stories passed down from father to son, from grandmother to grandchild, filled with mystery, fear, and that special wisdom that only those who grew up far from the city lights know. Today I brought you 12 tales that anyone who's ever lived in the sticks will recognize. These are stories that are part of our folklore, our way of being, and they still send shivers down the spine of anyone who hears them. So come closer, because the night is long, and these stories aren't for the faint of heart. First tale, The Man with the Sack. There was once a small farming community, one of those places that barely shows up on any map, where everybody knows everyone by name and family history. A strange man appeared there one day out of nowhere and built himself a little shack at the end of Main Street, right up against the woods. This fellow was tall, skinny as a fence post, always dressed in old black clothes, and carried a burlap sack on his back. Never spoke to anyone, just nodded when he passed folks on the street. The children were scared of him, and their mothers always warned, "Y'all stay away from that man with the sack, you hear?" But you know how kids are. The more their parents forbid something, the more curious they get. That's how little Johnny, son of Mr. Thompson, who ran the corner store, decided to follow the mysterious man one Saturday afternoon. Johnny hid behind trees and followed the man with the sack down the dirt road. The man walked slowly, always looking around, like he was searching for something. Every now and then he'd stop, open his sack, rummage around inside, and keep walking. When they reached the creek that runs through the community, the man stopped for good. Johnny hid behind a clump of cattails and kept watching. What he saw that day never left his memory. The man opened his sack and started pulling out bones, small bones that looked like they came from children. He laid them out one by one on the creek bank, like he was putting together some kind of puzzle. Then he took a piece of red cloth and wrapped it around the bones. Johnny got so scared he started shaking. He tried to sneak away quiet-like, but stepped on a dry branch that made a terrible crack. The man with the sack turned his head toward the boy, and Johnny saw red eyes glowing in the darkness. Without thinking twice, Johnny took off running like his tail was on fire, shot past the man, and didn't stop until he reached home. He arrived out of breath, sweating cold, and told his daddy everything. Mr. Thompson didn't believe the boy's story, figured it was just a child's imagination running wild. But the next morning, when they went to fetch water from the creek, they found the bones there, scattered along the bank, and the man with the sack had vanished. Nobody ever saw him in the community again. His little shack sat abandoned, and to this day, nobody has the guts to go near it. They say that on new moon nights, when the wind howls strong, you can still hear the sound of that sack dragging down the road. And the children of that community learn their lesson. When parents tell you not to mess with certain things, you better listen. Second tale, The Lady in White on the Highway. Anyone who's driven the back roads in the Devon night knows that the loneliness of darkness can bring strange visions. That's what happened to Joe Parker, a long-haul trucker who drove across the country hauling freight from one end to another. Joe was coming back from a delivery down in Georgia with an empty trailer when he decided to take a back road to cut some time. It was one of those old asphalt roads full of potholes that cuts through farmlands with nothing but woods on both sides. It was about 2 in the morning when he saw the woman. She was standing on the roadside, wearing a white dress that shone in the headlights of his trick. Joe slowed down, thinking it was someone needing help. When he got closer, he saw it was a beautiful woman, about 30 years old, with long, flowing hair. She waved at the truck, and Joe pulled over. He rolled down his window and asked if she needed anything. "She need a ride to town," she said in a sweet voice, almost whispering. "My car broke down back there." Joe looked in his rearview mirror but didn't see any broken-down car on the road. Even so, he figured it might have been further back, and being a good-hearted man, he told the woman to climb up. She got into the truck without making a sound, sat in the passenger seat, and stayed quiet. Joe tried to make conversation, asked her name, where she was from, but she only answered with single words. After a while, she just stopped responding altogether. Joe thought it was odd, but kept driving. The road was straight and he was getting sleepy, so he turned on the radio to stay alert. That's when things started getting weird. The radio started making strange noises, like it was picking up some kind of interference. Then it started playing a song Joe had never heard before, a sad song, like they'd play at a funeral. He tried to change the station, but every station was playing the same song. When he looked over, the woman wasn't there anymore. The passenger seat was empty. Joe hit the brakes right away, pulled over to the shoulder, and turned on all his lights. He searched the whole cab, even under the seats, but the woman had disappeared. Joe couldn't make heads or tails of it. How does someone vanish from inside a moving truck? He was sure she hadn't gotten out because he hadn't stopped the truck at any point. A bit spooked, he got back on the road and kept driving. But about 15 minutes later, he saw the woman again, standing in the same spot, waving at the truck. Joe floored it and drove right past without stopping. When he reached town, he found the nearest truck stop and told his story to the attendant. The man got serious and said it wasn't the first time someone had reported seeing the lady in white on that highway. She died in an accident there about 10 years ago. She was a young teacher coming in to work in town. Her car flipped on a dangerous curve and she was killed instantly. Ever since then, lots of folks have seen her hitchhiking on that road. Joe never took that road again in the middle of the night. And whenever a fellow trucker talks about taking shortcuts on deserted highways, he tells this story. Because there are some things in this world we can't explain, and it's better not to mess with them. Third tale, the Phantom Bull. Old Hank had a small farm, but well kept out in rural Kansas. He was a hard-working man who got up before sunrise to milk the cows and only stopped working when it got dark. He knew every animal on the farm by name and knew exactly how many head of cattle he had in the pasture.
But there was one bull that left Hank puzzled. It was a black bull, big, with enormous horns that gleamed in the sunlight. The strange thing was that this bull only appeared at night, and nobody could ever get close to it. During the day, Hank would count the cattle and always get the right number. But at night, when he'd take a walk around the pasture before bed, he always saw one extra bull, always the same black bull, grazing alone in the middle of the field. At first, Hank thought it might be some neighbor's bull jumping the fence. But when he talked to his neighbor Jake, who had the farm next door, he found out the man didn't have any black bulls in his herd. Must be a stray, Hank thought. I'll catch him and add him to my herd. But every time Hank tried to approach the black bull, the animal would simply disappear, like smoke dissolving in the air. Hank started thinking he was going crazy, but his wife Martha had also seen the mysterious bull. "Hank, that bull ain't of this world," Martha would say. "Best leave it be." But Hank was stubborn. He decided he was going to find out where that black bull came from, no matter what it took. On a full moon night, he grabbed his rifle, mounted his horse, and went after the black bull. He found the animal grazing in the farthest corner of the farm, near a grove of oak trees that Hank had planted years back. The bull raised its head when it saw Hank approaching, but this time it didn't disappear. It stood there, staring right at the farmer. Hank got down from his horse and started walking slowly toward the bull. When he got close, he saw that the animal's eyes glowed with a red light, like burning coals. It wasn't the light that reflects in animals' eyes when you shine a flashlight on them. This was a light that came from inside the eyes. The bull opened its mouth and made a sound Hank had never heard before. It wasn't a normal bull's bellow. It was a deep sound that seemed to come from underground, and it made the ground tremble beneath the farmer's feet. At that moment, Hank noticed he couldn't see the hoof prints in the ground. The animal was there, right in front of him, but it was like it had no weight. The grass under its feet wasn't trampled, and there were no hoof marks in the dirt. That's when Hank understood that Martha was right. This wasn't an ordinary bull. It was something from another world. Without taking his eyes off the animal, he backed away slowly, grabbed his horse, and headed home. The next morning, Hank sought out old Benedict, who was the local healer and understood these supernatural things. He told the whole story, and the old man shook his head worried. "Hank, that bull is the spirit of some animal that died with great anger or suffering. It's trapped on earth by some grief. You need to find out what happened and help the spirit find rest." Hank began investigating the history of the farm. He discovered that before he bought the land, something terrible had happened there. The previous owner was a cruel man who mistreated his animals. He had a black bull, in fact, that he would beat and starve out of pure meanness. The bull eventually died from so much suffering, and the former owner buried it there in the oak grove without any ceremony. Hank understood that the bull's spirit was wandering the farm, looking for peace. Following the healer's advice, Hank organized a small ceremony at the place where the bull had been buried. He prayed for the animal's soul to rest in peace and promised that as long as the farm was his, no animal would be mistreated. After that night, the black bull never appeared again. Hank lived another 20 years on the farm and always treated his animals with kindness and respect, because he learned that even animals have souls, and when we do evil, that evil can come back in ways we never imagine. Fourth tale, The Child Who Cried in the Well. On the Miller family homestead, there was an old well they hadn't used in years. It was a deep well dug into rock that had served the family for decades, but when running water came to the area, the well was abandoned and covered with old boards so nobody would fall in. The family had an 8-year-old girl, little Sarah, who was smart and curious, always asking about everything. She had a fertile imagination and loved making up stories and playing make-believe in the big yard of the homestead. One night, Sarah woke up to a strange sound. It was quiet crying, like a child's, that seemed to come from somewhere in the yard. She got up from her bed, went to her bedroom window, and listened. The crying continued, soft but constant. "Mama," Sarah called, "someone's crying outside." Mrs. Miller, the girl's mother, came to the room and listened too, but she didn't hear anything. "Must have been a dream, honey. Go back to sleep." But Sarah was sure of what she'd heard. The next night, the crying came back, and the night after that, always at the same time, always the same sad, quiet crying. Sarah started getting worried because she felt it was a child suffering, asking for help. On the fourth night, she decided to investigate on her own. She waited for everyone to fall asleep, snuck out through the kitchen door, and followed the sound of crying across the yard. The sound got stronger as she got closer to the back of the property where the abandoned well was. When she got near the well, Sarah was certain the crying was coming from down inside. She moved aside one of the boards that covered the well and looked down. It was all dark, couldn't see anything, but the crying was clear now. "Hello," Sarah called down into the well. "Is someone down there?" The crying stopped immediately. Complete silence. Sarah waited a bit, but didn't hear anything more.
She went back to the house kind of frustrated, not understanding what was happening. The next day, she told everything to her grandmother, Mrs. Rose, who was a wise woman and knew many old stories from the area. Grandma got serious when she heard her granddaughter's account. "Sarah," said Grandma, "do you remember the story I told you about your great-great-grandfather's daughter?" Sarah shook her head. Grandma sat down on the porch and began telling a story that had happened more than 100 years ago when the homestead was small and the family struggled to survive. Back then, Sarah's great-great-grandfather had a 5-year-old daughter named Little Rose. She was a happy child who loved playing near the well, throwing pebbles in the water and listening to the echo. But on a very hot summer day, the little girl slipped on the edge of the well and fell in. The father climbed down into the well to try to save his daughter, but when he got to the bottom, she had already drowned. It was a tragedy that marked the family forever. Little Rose was buried in the town cemetery, but the well was never the same. They say Little Rose's soul never accepted her death, and that sometimes she comes back to the well, crying, looking for her father.
Sarah was impressed by the story. That night, when the crying started again, she didn't go out to investigate. Instead, she opened her bedroom window and started talking out loud toward the well. "Little Rose," Sarah said, "if it's really you, you can stop crying. You're not alone. The family is still here, taking care of the homestead. You can rest in peace." The crying stopped immediately and never came back. Sarah grew up on that homestead, got married, had children, and always told this story to the family. Because she learned from a young age that sometimes we need to talk to the past so it will leave the present in peace. Fifth tale: The Horse That Returned from the Dead. Old Raymond was a man who understood horses like few others. He'd spent his whole life working with these animals, knew how to break the wildest ones and heal the sick ones. On his ranch, he always had a dozen horses, each with its own personality and story. But of all the horses Raymond ever had, one stood out: Thunder. He was a chestnut horse, cinnamon-colored, with a white mark on his forehead that looked like lightning. Thunder was strong, brave, and loyal. Raymond and he had been partners for more than 10 years, had been through everything together. Thunder knew the ranch better than any person. He knew where the best pastures were, where there was fresh water, and could find lost cattle in the thick woods. He was an intelligent horse who seemed to understand his owner's words. But time passed, and Thunder got old. He started limping, breathing with difficulty, and Raymond saw that his friend of so many years was reaching the end. One winter morning, he found Thunder collapsed in the pasture, lifeless. Raymond cried like a baby. He dug a deep grave under a tree where Thunder always liked to rest in the shade and buried the animal with great care. He placed a wooden cross on the grave and swore he'd never forget his faithful companion. But 3 days after the burial, something happened that left Raymond speechless. He was on the house porch drinking coffee when he heard a familiar whinny. He looked at the pasture and saw a chestnut horse with a white mark on its forehead, grazing peacefully. Raymond rubbed his eyes, thought he was seeing things, but the horse was there, real as life. He came down from the porch and walked slowly toward the animal. As he got closer, he became more and more certain it was Thunder. When he got near, the horse raised its head and looked at him. It was the same gentle, intelligent look as always. Raymond extended his hand, and Thunder came to him, let him pet his neck like he always did. "Can't be," Raymond murmured. "You're dead, old boy." But Thunder was there, alive, breathing. Raymond ran to the grave where he buried the horse. The dirt was undisturbed. The cross was still in place. He went back to the pasture, and Thunder was still there. Over the following days, Raymond kept watching the horse. Thunder behaved exactly like before, knew every corner of the ranch, obeyed commands, and had all the same habits. But there was something different about him. The horse didn't leave footprints in soft ground. When he walked through mud, there were no hoof marks left.
And at night, when the other animals took shelter, Thunder would stand still in the middle of the pasture, motionless like a statue, looking at the horizon. Raymond decided to mount the horse to see if he was really real. Thunder let him, like he always did. But when Raymond got in the saddle, he felt like the horse had no weight. It was like he'd mounted the wind. Even so, Thunder galloped around the ranch, up and down the hills, across the streams, but he made no sound at all. It was a silent gallop, as if his hooves didn't touch the ground. After a week, Raymond sought out the town preacher and told the whole story. The preacher, a holy and experienced man, came to the ranch to see the horse with his own eyes. "My son," said the preacher after observing Thunder, "this animal came back because it has a mission to fulfill. Faithful horses sometimes do this. They return to take care of their owner one last time." And the preacher was right. 2 weeks later, Raymond had a heart attack while alone on the ranch. Thunder appeared out of nowhere, knelt on the ground, and Raymond managed to get on him. The horse galloped to town, stopped at the hospital door, and disappeared. Raymond was saved because of how quickly he got to the hospital, and he never saw Thunder again, because the horse had fulfilled his mission to save his owner one last time. Raymond lived another 15 years after that, and always said he owed his life to the faithful friend who came back from beyond to help him. Sixth tale, the house that nobody could sell. In the town of Millbrook, there was a house that was the most beautiful on Main Street. It was a big house, 2 stories, with a front porch and a well-kept garden. It had been built by a rich merchant in the 1950s who wanted to show everyone his success. But the house had a problem. Nobody could live in it for very long. The merchant himself who built the house moved out after only 6 months, saying the place felt heavy. Since then, several families had tried to live there, but they all ended up running away. The story was always the same. Families would move in excited, thinking they'd found the house of their dreams. But after a few weeks, strange things would start happening. Doors slamming by themselves, footsteps upstairs when nobody was there, and a constant feeling that someone was watching. What scared people most was the sound that came from the kitchen during the night. It was a noise of pots and pans clanging, like someone was cooking. But when people went down to check, they'd find the kitchen empty and silent, with all the pots in their place. After several years, the house sat empty. No family wanted to risk living there. The owners tried to sell, but even offering it at a very low price, no buyers appeared. Everyone in town knew the story of the haunted house. That's when a young couple arrived in town from Chicago. Robert and Maria had just gotten married and were looking for a cheap place to start their life. When they saw the house listing, they were interested because of the low price. "There must be something wrong with it," said Maria. "A house like that for that price?" But Robert was skeptical, didn't believe in ghosts or such things. "It's just an old house. Country folks are superstitious. Let's take a look." They visited the house and liked it. It was spacious, well-maintained, and perfect for them. The owner, eager to get rid of the house, made an even better price. Robert and Maria closed the deal that same week. The first few days were peaceful. The couple moved in, arranged the house the way they liked it, and everything seemed normal. Robert made fun of neighbors who asked if they weren't afraid of living in the haunted house. But in the first week, the nighttime noises began. Maria would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of pots and pans in the kitchen. She'd wake Robert, and they'd both go down to check. They never found anything. "Must be the wind," Robert would say, but he wasn't so convinced anymore. Things got worse. Doors started slamming by themselves, even when there was no wind. The television would turn on and off without anyone touching the remote, and there was always that feeling that someone was watching. Maria started getting nervous. She couldn't sleep properly, was always jumpy. Robert tried to calm his wife, but he himself was starting to get bothered by the strange things happening in the house. One night, what happened made the couple run away for good. Maria woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen to get water. When she turned on the light, she saw an elderly woman standing by the stove, stirring a pot that didn't exist. The woman had her back turned, wore an old black dress, and had gray hair pulled back in a bun. Maria was paralyzed with fear, couldn't move or scream. The woman turned slowly and looked at her. She had a sad face, marked by suffering, and eyes that seemed to cry without tears. The woman opened her mouth as if to say something, but only a whisper came out that Maria couldn't understand. Then, the apparition dissolved like smoke. Maria screamed desperately. Robert came running downstairs, found his wife passed out on the kitchen floor. When she came to and told what she'd seen, they both packed their bags right away and left the house, leaving everything behind. Later, investigating the house's history, they discovered that the mother of the merchant who built the house had died there, in the kitchen, from a heart attack while preparing dinner. The old lady had been very attached to that house and apparently continued taking care of the kitchen even after death. The house remains empty to this day. Every now and then some interested buyer appears, but when they tell the story, the person gives up immediately, because there are some houses that belong more to the dead than to the living, and it's better to leave them in peace. Seventh tale, The Bell That Rang by Itself. In the town of Riverside, there's an old church built more than 200 years ago that has always been the heart of the community. St. Mary's Church sits on top of a hill, and its bell can be heard throughout the town when it rings to call the faithful to Mass. But for several decades, the bell has been ringing by itself, without anyone pulling the rope. Always at the same time, midnight sharp. It wasn't a normal tolling calling people to Mass. It was a funeral toll, slow and melancholy, that left everyone in town with a heavy heart. Father Michael, who had taken care of the church for 15 years, was puzzled by the phenomenon. At first, he thought it might be some mechanical problem with the bell, or maybe someone playing a prank. But after several investigations, he couldn't find an explanation. One night, the priest decided to stay in the church to observe the bell up close. At 11:30 at night, he climbed up to the bell tower and waited. The bell was hanging normally, the rope was in place, and there was not enough wind to move it. When midnight struck, the bell began ringing by itself. Father Michael saw with his own eyes. The bronze moved slowly, as if an invisible hand was pulling the rope. The sound echoed through the sleeping town, a sad tolling that seemed to carry all the world's pain. The priest stayed there, watching until the bell stopped ringing. It was exactly 12 tolls, like a clock marking the hour. Then, total silence. Father Michael came down from the bell tower disturbed, not understanding what he had witnessed. The next day, he sought out the town's oldest residents to see if anyone knew any story about the bell. It was Mrs. Dorothy, 92 years old, who told what had happened decades ago. "Father," said the old lady, "that bell has tolled for many people who passed away, but there was one time it couldn't ring when it should have." Mrs. Dorothy told how during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, many people died in the town. The church bell ringer, John Baptist, worked day and night, ringing the bell to announce each death. He was a dedicated man who took his job very seriously. But one night, John Baptist also fell victim to the flu. He died alone in his little house near the church without anyone knowing. They only discovered his body 3 days later, and in those 3 days, several people died in town without the bell ringing to announce their deaths. Since then, explained Mrs. Dorothy, that bell rings by itself at midnight, as if John Baptist came back to fulfill the duty he couldn't fulfill when he died. Father Michael was impressed by the story. That night, he returned to the church at midnight. When the bell began ringing by itself, he said a prayer for bell ringer John Baptist's soul, asking him to find peace and rest. The bell continued ringing, but the priest noticed something different. The sound was less melancholy, almost gentle. After the 12 tolls, the priest heard a weak voice, like a whisper in the wind. "Thank you, Father." From that night on, the bell never rang by itself again. Father Michael remained in the town for another 20 years and always told this story to new residents, because he learned that even after death, some people continue trying to fulfill their duties, and sometimes they just need a prayer to find rest. Eighth tale: The Old Woman Who Knew Too Much. In the town of Clearwater, there lived an old woman named Miss Abigail, whom everyone respected and at the same time feared a little. She was a tiny woman, always dressed in black, who walked bent over, leaning on a dark wooden cane. Miss Abigail had a gift that frightened people. She knew that things before they happened. These weren't vague predictions like those of fortune tellers or psychics. She knew specific details, dates, names, places, and she was never wrong. That's how she predicted the mayor's death 3 days before he had a stroke. She warned about the flood that would swamp the lower part of the town a week before the rains came. And she told the store owner that her son would return from the war safe and sound when everyone had already lost hope.
People came looking for Mrs. Abigail when they were desperate, wanting to know about sick relatives, businesses that weren't working out, or lost loves. She never charged money, but always asked for something in return. A gallon of milk, a dozen eggs, or sometimes just for the person to do a good deed for someone in need. But there was something strange about Mrs. Abigail. She never talked about her own future. When someone asked how she would die or when, she would go quiet and change the subject. It was as if this knowledge was forbidden to her.
Tommy, the pharmacist's son, was a curious and skeptical young man. He didn't believe in Mrs. Abigail's gift, thought it was all charlatanism. He decided he was going to expose the old woman once and for all. Tommy started frequenting Mrs. Abigail's house, asking tricky questions, trying to catch her in a contradiction. But the old woman always got everything right. She said Tommy's girlfriend would break up with him, and she did the following week, that he would pass the civil service exam he'd taken, he did pass, and that he would find lost money in his backyard. He found a can buried with old coins. Frustrated, Tommy decided to ask the question nobody had the courage to ask. "Mrs. Abigail, how are you going to die?" The old woman became serious, looked deep into the young man's eyes, and for the first time in her life seemed uncertain. "Boy," she said, "there are certain things that shouldn't be asked. There's knowledge that's too dangerous." But Tommy insisted. He was stubborn as a mule. "If you really know the future, you must know your own future too." Mrs. Abigail sighed deeply, as if she were making a very difficult decision. "All right," she finally said, "but if I tell you, you'll carry this knowledge for the rest of your life. Are you sure you want to know?" Tommy said yes. The old woman closed her eyes, was silent for several minutes, and when she opened her eyes again, they were full of tears. "I'm going to die in 3 days," she said. "On Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon. I'll be sitting in my porch chair, watching children play in the street.
There'll be a pain in my chest, sharp as a knife, and I'll pass without suffering." Tommy was frightened. He hadn't expected such a specific and immediate answer. "Mrs. Abigail, can't you do something to prevent it?" The old woman shook her head. "When you know too much about the future, boy, you lose the ability to change it. That's why I never wanted to know about my own death. Now that I know, I can't escape it." Tommy left there disturbed. He spent the next 3 days anxious, unable to concentrate on anything. On Wednesday, at 2:30 in the afternoon, he went to Mrs. Abigail's house. She was sitting on the porch, as she had predicted, watching children play in the street. "Mrs. Abigail," Tommy called, "don't you want to go inside? It's getting pretty hot out here." The old woman smiled sadly. "No, boy, this is where it has to be." At 3 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Abigail put her hand to her chest, grimaced in pain, and closed her eyes. When Tommy got close, she had already passed away. She died exactly as she had predicted. Tommy carried this experience for the rest of his life. He never doubted the supernatural again, but also never wanted to know the future ahead of time, because he learned that there's knowledge too heavy for any person to carry. Ninth tale: The Car That Drove Itself. On the highway that connects Springfield to Riverside, there was a legend that all the drivers in the area knew. It was the story of the Blue Beetle that drove itself down the highway on Friday nights. Anyone who saw the car always said the same thing. It was an old Beetle, faded blue, that drove properly, following traffic rules, but there was nobody behind the wheel. The car went at a constant speed, not too slow or too fast, and always in the same direction, from Springfield to Riverside. Eddie, a trucker who'd been driving that route for more than 20 years, was one who'd seen the phantom Beetle most often. The first time was on a night in 1985. He was hauling grain going down a long hill when he saw the Beetle in front of him. "I thought it was strange," Eddie would tell. "The car was driving just fine, but when I tried to pass to see the driver, there was nobody inside. It was like a ghost was driving." Eddie followed the Beetle for about 15 miles. The car took curves perfectly, stopped at intersections when other vehicles came, and even used turn signals when it was going to turn, but there was no driver at all. In Riverside, the Beetle turned onto a side street and simply disappeared. Eddie stopped his truck and went looking for it, but couldn't find the car anywhere. It was like it had dissolved into thin air. Other truckers and drivers started reporting the same thing. The Blue Beetle always appeared on Friday nights, always on the same stretch of highway, always with the same strange behavior. It never caused accidents, never bothered traffic, just drove alone down the highway. The explanation for the phenomenon came from old Gerald, a retired mechanic who'd lived in Riverside for more than 70 years. He told the story of Anthony Charles, a young man who had died on that highway in the 1970s. Anthony Charles was a responsible young man who worked at a factory in Riverside and every weekend went to visit his girlfriend in Springfield. He had a Blue Beetle, 1968 model, that was the pride of his life. He took care of that car like it was a precious jewel. One Friday night, Anthony Charles was coming back from Springfield after proposing to his girlfriend. She had said yes, and he was euphoric, eager to tell his parents the news. But on the highway, a truck crossed into the wrong lane on a dangerous curve. Anthony Charles swerved to avoid hitting the truck head-on, but lost control of the Beetle. The car flipped several times and fell into a ravine. The young man was killed instantly. The trucker who caused the accident fled and was never identified. "Since then," explained old Gerald, "Anthony Charles keeps making the trip he made every Friday. It's like he doesn't know he died and keeps going to visit his girlfriend in Springfield." Eddie was moved by the story. The following Friday, when he saw the phantom beetle again, instead of trying to pass, he slowed down and followed the car respectfully. When they reached Riverside, Eddie honked twice, like a farewell. The beetle blinked its tail lights as if it were saying thank you, and disappeared around the curve. From that day on, whenever he saw the phantom car, Eddie did the same thing, followed respectfully, and said goodbye with his horn. Other drivers started doing the same thing. Anthony Charles's beetle became a familiar presence on the highway. It was never again seen as a frightening apparition, but as the soul of a young man in love who continued making the journey of love, even after death. 10th tale: The Teacher Who Wouldn't Leave the School. In the town of Oakville, there was a small rural school that served children from several farms in the area. It was a simple school, made of wood, with 2 classrooms and a playground where children played at recess.
Mrs. Helen was the principal of the school for more than 30 years. She was a dedicated woman who arrived early and left late, always concerned about the children's education. Even after retiring, she kept showing up at school, organizing materials, helping new teachers, tending the garden. But Mrs. Helen started getting sick. First it was a flu that wouldn't go away, then constant weakness, until doctors discovered advanced cancer. In a few months, she became very weak. Even sick, Mrs. Helen insisted on going to school. "Those children need me," she'd say. "I can't abandon them now." Family members tried to convince her to rest, but Mrs. Helen was stubborn. She continued going to school until the last day she could get out of bed. She died on a Thursday morning, at home, but with her thoughts on the school. The funeral was on Friday, and the school was closed so teachers and students could say goodbye to Mrs. Helen. On Saturday, when everything returned to normal, strange things started happening. Mrs. Patricia, the new principal, arrived at school Monday morning and found all the classrooms arranged, the floor swept, and the garden watered. She thought the janitor had worked over the weekend, but when she asked him, the man said he hadn't been to the school. On Tuesday, the same thing. The school was spotless, as if someone had spent all night cleaning and organizing. Besides that, Mrs. Patricia started feeling a familiar presence in the hallways, as if Mrs. Helen was there, watching everything. The children noticed too. Little Peter, 7 years old, said he saw a gray-haired lady arranging books in the library. Annie told that she heard someone humming in the teacher's lounge. And Joey swore he saw Mrs. Helen in the playground, watering the flowers. Mrs. Patricia got worried. She didn't know whether to believe the children's stories or if it was just imagination. But when she herself started seeing shadows in the hallways and hearing footsteps when the school was empty, she understood that something supernatural was happening. One night, Mrs. Patricia decided to stay at school late to finish some reports. It was almost 9 at night when she heard the sound of chairs being dragged in one of the classrooms. She grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. When she reached the classroom, she saw Mrs. Helen sitting at the teacher's desk, grading papers. She was translucent, like an image reflected in glass, but it was unmistakably her. Mrs. Helen looked up, smiled at Mrs. Patricia, and waved, as she always did. "Mrs. Helen," Mrs. Patricia murmured, "you can rest now. I'm going to take good care of the school and the children." Mrs. Helen's apparition smiled more broadly, made a gesture of approval with her head, and slowly faded away like smoke dispersing. From that night on, the strange things stopped happening at the school. Mrs. Patricia never told this story to anyone, afraid they'd think she was crazy, but she continued taking care of the school with the same love that Mrs. Helen had.
because she understood that some people are so dedicated to what they do that not even death can separate them from their work.
11th tale. The Boy Who Came Back to Play. On the Johnson family farm in rural Oklahoma, there lived a boy named Little Billy, only 6 years old. He was a happy child, full of life, who loved playing in the big farmyard with his wooden toys that Grandpa made for him. Billy had a collection of cars, horses, and little figures that Grandpa Jim carved in his spare time. The boy spent hours playing under a big tree in the back of the yard, making up stories and adventures with his toys. But one Sunday afternoon, tragedy struck. Billy was playing near the corral when an angry bull managed to break through the fence. The animal, scared and nervous, charged at the boy. When the adults arrived, it was too late. The family was devastated. Grandpa Jim, who loved his little grandson so much, fell into deep sadness. He put all of Billy's toys in a wooden box and hid it in the attic of the house. He couldn't look at the toys without remembering his dear grandson. But a few days after the funeral, strange things started happening. Billy's mother, Mrs. Carroll, heard children's laughter in the yard during the afternoon. When she went to see what it was, she found no one. But the grass under the tree where Billy played was flattened, as if someone had been there. Grandpa Jim also started noticing strange things. Early in the morning, when he went to milk the cows, he'd find Billy's toys scattered under the tree. They were the same toys he'd stored in the attic, but they appeared mysteriously in the yard. At first, Jim thought someone in the family was messing with the box without him knowing. But when he checked the attic, the box was there, closed, with all the toys inside. How could the toys be in 2 places at once? One afternoon, Jim decided to watch the yard from his bedroom window. He wanted to find out what was happening. Around 3 o'clock, he saw a scene he never forgot. Billy was there, playing under the tree like he always did. He was transparent, like an image reflected in glass, but it was unmistakably him. The boy was playing with his wooden cars, making motor sounds, and laughing alone like he always did. Jim ran downstairs to the yard. When he got under the tree, Billy looked at him and smiled. The boy stretched out his little arms as if he wanted a hug from Grandpa. "Grandpa Jim," said Billy, in that sweet voice Jim missed so much, "why did you put away my toys? I still want to play with them." Jim knelt down and tried to hug his little grandson, but his arms went right through the apparition. Even so, he could feel the warmth and love coming from the child. "Billy," said Jim, crying, "you can't stay here, son. You have to go to the place where children who passed away go." "But I like playing here, Grandpa. And you're all so sad. I don't like it when you cry." Jim understood that his grandson's spirit was trapped on the farm because the family couldn't accept the child's death. The boy felt everyone's pain and couldn't leave in peace. That night, Jim gathered the whole family and told what he'd seen. At first, nobody believed it, but when he took them all to the yard and they saw Billy playing under the tree, they understood it was true. The family made a circle around the tree and started talking to Billy. They said they would always love him, but that he needed to go to a place where he could be happy. They promised they would never forget him and that one day they would meet again. Billy listened to everything in silence, with that seriousness that children sometimes have. Then he smiled, waved to the whole family, and slowly faded away like sunlight that goes out at the end of the day. From that day on, Billy never appeared again, but the family kept his toys on a shelf in the living room, where all the children who visited the farm could play with them. Because Jim understood that the best way to honor his grandson's memory was to let other children feel the joy those toys brought.
12th Tale, The Last Train. At the old railway station in Twin Oaks, you can still hear the whistle of a train that doesn't exist anymore. The station was deactivated more than 20 years ago. The tracks were removed, and today only the abandoned station building remains, which became a meeting place for the town's young people. But every first Friday of the month, at 8 o'clock at night, the sound of an approaching train echoes through the town. It's an unmistakable sound, the noise of wheels on tracks, the locomotive's whistle, and the screech of brakes stopping at the station. Old Oscar, who was an engineer on that line for more than 40 years, knows that sound well. He lives in a house near the old station, and whenever he hears the phantom train, he goes to the window to watch. "It's the 8:15 train," Oscar tells. "It was the last train of the day that took workers back home after their shift." Oscar was the engineer of that train. For decades he made the same trip every day, left the main station in the morning, stopped at several small towns, and returned at 8:15 at night with passengers who worked in the big city. It was work that Oscar loved. He knew all the passengers by name, knew their family stories, watched children grow up who traveled with their parents. The train wasn't just transportation, it was part of the community's life. But the day came when the railroad company decided to deactivate the line. It wasn't profitable anymore, they said. The company executives thought everyone could buy cars or take buses. They didn't understand that for many people, the train was more than transportation. It was tradition. It was history. The last trip was on a Friday, first week of December. Oscar was sad but tried to hide it so he wouldn't make the passengers more upset. Many of them were also going to lose their jobs in the city because they had no way to get to work without the train. When the train arrived at Twin Oaks Station at 8:15 that last night, Oscar got down from the locomotive and said goodbye to each passenger. Some were crying. Others thanked him for years of safe travel. It was a very emotional moment. Oscar was forced into retirement and stayed living in town. Every day he went to the abandoned station and watched the empty tracks. It was like a part of his soul had stayed on those tracks. 3 months after the line was deactivated, Oscar woke up on a Friday to the familiar sound of the approaching train. He thought he was dreaming, but the noise continued. It was exactly the same sound as the 8:15 train. He ran to the window and saw an impossible scene. The train was there, stopped at the station, with all the lights on. He could see passengers through the windows. They were the same people who traveled with him every day. Oscar went downstairs and walked to the station. When he got near the train, the conductor got down and waved at him. It was Antonio, who had been his partner for more than 15 years and had died of a heart attack 2 months earlier. "Oscar," Antonio called, "the train's waiting for you. It's time for the last trip." Oscar looked inside the train and saw familiar faces. They were passengers who had died over the years, but who remained faithful to the railway line. They all smiled and waved at him. The old engineer understood that his time had come to leave too. He got up in the locomotive, felt the familiar pleasure of being in control of the train, and gave the departure signal. The train started moving, the whistle echoed through the town, and they left for the final journey. The next morning they found Oscar dead in bed, with a peaceful smile on his face. He had died in his sleep, without suffering. At the funeral, many people said they had heard the train the night before, and that they had dreamed of the old engineer waving from the locomotive. Since then, on the first Friday of each month, the phantom train continues passing through the station.
It's Oscar and his passengers continuing to make the journey they loved so much, because some things are too important to die, even when the modern world tries to bury them. Final thoughts. These are the 12 tales that country folk tell, stories passed down from generation to generation, filled with mystery, fear, and wisdom. They're stories that speak of our people, our deepest fears, and our way of understanding the world. Those who grew up in the countryside know that life in rural areas has its own rules, its own mysteries. The night is darker, the silence is deeper, and the distance between the living and the dead seems smaller. That's why these stories make so much sense to those who've lived this reality. It doesn't matter whether you believe these stories or not. What's important is that they're part of our culture, our way of seeing the world. They're stories that teach us about respect, about tradition, about the importance of taking care of each other. And when you hear someone telling a tale like this around a campfire or at a country gathering, remember, these stories are more than entertainment. They're the living memory of our people, the wisdom of our ancestors, and the way we found to make sense of things we can't explain. So respect these stories. Don't mock them. Don't dismiss them as superstition, because they carry something very valuable, the soul of our people, the essence of what it means to be from rural America. And always remember, no matter how much the world changes, no matter how much technology advances, there will always be a place for a good tale told on a dark night, under the stars, with the sound of crickets singing in the background. Because these stories are part of who we are, and nobody can take that away from us.
Do you enjoy chilling stories, mysterious legends, and tales that make you think twice before turning off the lights? Then you're in the right place. On this channel, every video is a journey into the unknown, bringing you spooky tales, curiosities, and mysteries you won't find just anywhere. So hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who also loves a good dark story. That way you'll help our community grow and make sure you don't miss the next tale.